Hello everybody and welcome to part 16 of my FTC programming tutorial videos. This video is going to be Gamepad part 2, storing gamepad state and rising and falling edge detectors. I know I'm doing this a little bit out of order as I've previously been talking about autonomous mode, but this is something that I feel like is important to cover and I'm pretty confident in talking about this subject, so I can kind of get through this video pretty quickly without much planning. So, talking about gamepad state storage and rising and falling edge detectors. So if you remember this teleop mode that I wrote a while back talking about gamepad rate limit with the deadline with our drive power toggle, the reason for using the deadline was to prevent multiple triggers of the same if statement with one button press. So what will often happen when you have a toggle like this is when you go to press your gamepad button, it could actually trigger twice and nothing would happen, or it could trigger once or 3 times or 5 times and it would successfully toggle whatever it is you're toggling. In this case, our drive power. So the solution that I proposed in a previous video talking about the deadline type was to set a rate limit on your gamepad. So we're only going to read the gamepad state once every 500 milliseconds, or every time it has previously been triggered, we're going to wait a minimum of 500 milliseconds. Now, this can be useful for a number of cases, but particularly in this case, it may not be what you want. What you might want is something called a rising edge detector. Now, a rising edge detector is going to only detect a gamepad press when it is initially pressed down, and it will never trigger again until after you release the gamepad button. Now, we do this by keeping track of gamepad state and holding on to what was previously true. So if our gamepad button is now being pressed and previously it was not being pressed, we can successfully go through our control scheme and go and do our toggle. Then every time we go to check as we're holding down the button, if the rising edge detector is true, it will never trigger again because the previous gamepad state will always contain the button that we're currently holding down. Then we have to let go of the button and press it again for the rising edge detector to trigger. Now, consequently, a falling edge detector is going to do a similar thing, except it's only going to trigger when you let go of the button. So this can be useful for if you want something more along the lines of, you want something to trigger when you let go of a button, maybe you have a different action style or your driver has a different preference. There are situations where you can use both. I'm mainly going to talk about rising edge detectors in this case. So let's go ahead and adapt the program that I had written for deadline for storing gamepad states and using a rising edge detector. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of the deadline stuff as we just do not need it anymore. We're not going to use it. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it. We'll come back to this little if statement in a second after we set up everything we need to keep track of our gamepad state. So the first thing we need to do is we need to import our gamepad. Now, we didn't need to do this previously because we were working with the gamepad type that's provided to us in op mode, but because we're going to be using it explicitly, we actually do have to import this now. So after we do that, I'm going to create our gamepad variable, and I'm going to call this previous1. And I'm going to make it equal to new gamepad. Now, I'm calling this previous1 because you can do this for both gamepads. You can have one gamepad keep track of the previous values of gamepad 1 and then one for gamepad 2. I'm just going to cover gamepad 1 in this case, but keep in mind that you can, of course, use both gamepads for this. So after we have that, the next thing we want to do is at the end of each op mode loop, we want to set previous1 to copy over gamepad 1. This way, after we go through all the actions of everything, we keep track of this gamepad state before we update it again in the next loop. Now that we have all of this, we're actually totally set up to set up our rising edge detector. So for a rising edge detector, we want gamepad1.a to be true, but we don't want previous1.a to be true. And this way, as we're holding down the button, the previous thing is always going to be true, so we're not going to do any triggering. Now, if you wanted to set up a falling edge detector, it would just be the reverse. So we don't want the current to be true, but we do want the previous to be true. Maybe you want to have something that triggers when you initially hold down the button, and then consequently something that happens when you release that same button pair. However you want to do it, I'm going to leave it as a rising edge detector just because I think that makes more sense for me in this case, but that's something that you can play around yourselves. All right, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions about anything that I just covered, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next video.